New to knitting? Do you want to learn knitting patterns that are simple, yet sassy? Here are some knitting patterns for beginners. Your knitting journey begins here. Stitch on. Knitting is an art and craft and a great stress buster. It soothes the senses with subtlety and aids in reducing the stress pile accumulated over the day. Art lovers would agree that knitting gives them a peaceful vent for emotions. It could be defined as a peace-loving and silent yet satisfying pursuit. Knitting serves to be a soft canvas for our subconscious mind where thoughts, that are buried deep within, receive a prominent platform. Knitting, as a hobby, is evergreen. One could never get bored with it, as there are several patterns for you to explore and create. As for an artist, the whole world could be captured on the canvas and the soft canvas. Knitting patterns for beginners should include basic and easy designs. The basics of knitting. Knitting is very easy to learn. You don't need to get all worked up. You will be able to deliver the goods within no time if you know the 4 basics of knitting. 1. Casting on. 2. Binding off. 3. Knitting. And 4. Purling. The different knitting patterns for beginners could follow suit. Casting on. This is the basic stitch that the beginner must learn. Knitting for beginners starts with the basic cast-on stitch. There are several ways and methods that could be employed to create cast-on stitches, but here is an easy one. Keep in mind that the first step to knitting is to make a slip knot. The slip knot forms a loop, which is the most important part of any knitting project you undertake. Once the loop is formed in the yarn, a part of the stitch needs to be put back into the loop and pulled. Choose a needle and pass the slip knot through it. You need to pull the yarn so that the loop closes. Don't pull the yarn too vigorously, as the loop might get too tight against the needle you have chosen. The degree of tightness the stitch experiences against the needle is called tension. To decide how tight the stitches should be, is indeed the most difficult session to endure as a new knitter. Having the stitch deucedly tight would make knitting patterns a pain, in the first place. Knit stitch. The knit stitch is more or less the same as a cast-on stitch. For a knit stitch, the needle in your left hand should be in front of the needle in your right. The right-hand needle should be placed in such a manner that it has the yarn twirled around it. The needle in the right hand should shift in front. Now, remove the loop from the left-hand needle. Proceed with the knit stitch until you reach the end of the row. Purling stitch. The purl stitch is formed in a way opposite to the knit stitch formation. For a purl stitch, the needle in your left hand should be behind the needle in your right. The left-hand needle should be placed in such a way that it has the yarn wrapped around it. The needle in the left hand should shift in front. Now, remove the loop from the right-hand needle. Binding off. Knit 2 stitches and lift 1 stitch with your left-hand needle over the right-hand needle, giving the piece a finished look. To complete the piece, knitting stitches have to continue right till the moment you are left with no stitch on the left and 1 stitch on the right. Pass the stitch off the needle and snip the yarn ball thread. Happy knitting! Here are a few knitting patterns for beginners. Snatch a look. Knitting patterns for beginners. As we have now garnered some information on the 4 basics of knitting, we can afford to embark on our journey of knitting with the easy knitting patterns for beginners. One of the most popular and easy knitting pattern for beginners is knitting a scarf. However, one need not stick to the conventional startups in knitting. Though there is no harm in including a scarf to your list of startup projects, you may also look into exploring the patterns for coasters, ring napkins, dishcloths, little patterns on handkerchiefs and cute hats. Referring to a few knitting patterns for beginners could help you employ a step-by-step approach in terms of technique and would prove to be fulfilling projects. You could make a dishcloth with just cast on, purl and knit stitch. Dishcloths are easy to make as they are small and give you a whole lot of fulfillment when you are done with them. A woolen hat is another downy, beginner's knitting pattern that could be followed to have a cozy chapeau. Knit the hat flat and then curl or fold the edge to get a conventional yet great-looking hat. You could make a cute little hat for your little one as well. A sassy knitting pattern for the beginner includes knitting coasters. The knit Purl and cast on are the basic stitches that you would require to make a set coasters. They are small and easy to design. Little tea cozies are also a beginner's knitting project. For this you need to measure your teapot thoroughly to avoid any tragic results. Use differently hued yarns to make your tea cozy all the more appealing. Make sure that you have the measurements right. Jot down figures systematically on a sheet of paper. Measure the circumference at the top, the middle and the bottom of the teapot. The middle one would be the widest in diameter, followed by the lid portion and lastly the bottom. While knitting, you are required to leave a stretch in the widest portion of the wool for the sprout. You may have the lid cozy as well, or you may leave it partially open for the lid to tampon the grip. Another very innovative yet simple knitting pattern to make is a cell phone cover. You could have the cover adorned in 2 or 3 hues. Stitch buttons on one side of the case and 2 straps on the other, fasten the cover. Another knitting pattern for beginners is knitting a stylish napkin ring. If you have spare cotton wool, you could make a number of them with knit, purl and cast off stitches. You could stitch these napkin rings in 3 different styles using the garter stitch, the stockinette and a rib stitch. By knitting a bandana, a beginner could also learn another skill called increasing. Try these easy knitting patterns for yourself. As you get acquainted with the basic knitting techniques and patterns, you would be able to move on and explore other knitting avenues. As a beginner, one may restrict oneself to work with easy styles, but one could go ahead and experiment with colors. Using different colors of wool could add variety to your knitting projects in its own way. Knitting patterns for the novice could be found in books and guides devoted to knitting. So, try these knitting patterns for beginners and keep knitting. The Knitter's Way.